Double homicide. Thanks for joining us.
The second
Kathryn
story of my
and Miss
three-part
Betty
series
Jones
on the
were
Labor Day
brutally
murders.
murdered inside
I sat
her
down
home
with one
on
of the
Labor
victim's
Day in
sisters to learn
1990.
more about a
on
life
September
that
3rd,
was
1990.
tragically cut
Their
short.
killer has never been found.
5 years
In the
ago,
final
two women were murdered in Starkville, and their killer has never been caught.
In partnership with Swell Story Media, this is Knock Knock, the unsolved murders of Betty Jones and Kathryn Krigler. My name is Jason B. Jones.
Forensic investigators solved a landmark cold case that could change the way police investigations are conducted.
I stand before you to announce the arrest of a suspect that has terrorized our community. But today I'm proud to announce yesterday the LAPD arrested Lonnie David Franklin Jr. And they found the man we believe to be the Grim Sleeper.
Because we're in the midst of a very powerful new technology. They developed unique software. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the country. But we can search for someone in our database who has a family member. And that's exactly what happened in this case.
This will change the way policing is done in the United States.
This is something that I believe, if we look at DNA, it probably will be the most revolutionary kind of technique.
Jill Spriggs, who heads the lab, says forensic scientists recently developed a powerful investigative weapon called the Familial DNA Search program, computer software that can find similarities between crime scene DNA and the DNA of a convicted felon. If a killer's DNA is not in the database, maybe a relative's is.
It is only convicted offenders that we're comparing to.
Since releasing episode 5, featuring our interview with Sergeant Bill Lott, the lead investigator from Betty and Kathryn's case, the response has been pretty amazing. So many of you listeners are beginning to ask questions about our progress and are eager to understand what can be done to move the case forward. You really have no idea how touched we all are that this is becoming so important to you, and how passionate everyone is to help. In this episode, we dig in further to the emerging tools available to law enforcement and discuss ways to make using these tools a possibility in the state of Mississippi. I recently spoke with Rockne Harmon, who is an advocate and expert for familial DNA search.
I'm Rockne Harmon, was a prosecutor at Alameda County, California for 33 years. I've been retired for 10 years, but I've still been working on trying to convince states to do familial searching like 11 states so far have done. I was a prosecutor for 33 years in Alameda County, California. I've been retired for 10 years, over 10 years now. I got involved in DNA before the beginning of DNA with what we used to do before we had DNA, and that just put me in a position to be invited to participate in the early development and introduction of DNA in courtrooms. And so over time, things evolved. We did a lot of cold case work, successfully prosecuted people on cases 25, 30 years old. And towards the end of my time, I got exposed to something called familial DNA searching and began to realize that there was little interest and much resistance to doing familial DNA searching. And so in California, we have, and there still is a committee that consists mostly of prosecutors from major counties, but also lab people. And so I use that as a vehicle to sit down with the state and try to understand what their objections were. And once I realized none of them were science, and they were all policy and philosophy and law, then I was able to, through contacting the Attorney General, convince the higher-ups in California that familial searching was a good idea. And our Attorney General, now our governor, had no hesitation in agreeing and deciding that familial searching was in order to try to solve more crimes with DNA. And so that happened just as I had retired in 2008. When I spend time dealing with the system anymore, it's almost always with familial DNA searching and speaking about it, trying to get states into open discussions about familial DNA searching, and that's how we met.
And you know, in 1990, which is when my grandmother and her friend Kathryn were killed, it was really early on in DNA research, and I know that you had a part to play in, you know, telling the world about DNA search in the OJ Simpson trial. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I know that it was a little bit at the time perceived as junk science. Obviously, we know now that it's a huge part of finding the truth. Can you talk a little bit about the hesitancy early on?
We actually, in Alameda County, we had our first DNA case in '89. And because I had a lot of exposure to it, we were at the early end of the curve on doing that. And so I had been involved in a lot of things around the country. So when OJ was charged, I was asked to help. It was just kind of open-ended thing. But I spent most of a year down in LA, you know, preparing for the trial and during the trial. And I mean, you're right in the sense that some people, it's too easy to say, oh, you know, the OJ case opened people's eyes to it. And it's just that it was so highly publicized. You know, there was nothing about what happened in that case that's different than what happened in most other cases. In fact, there's probably more DNA work done in that case, certainly than any case I've ever seen. And so that, you know, it's not a good idea to draw conclusions from what you see on TV, whether it's, you know, broadcasting a trial. If the truth comes out of a criminal trial, it's just serendipitous because one set of attorneys' jobs is to prevent the truth from coming out if it hurts their client.
Tell me a bit about just the evolution of the science around DNA from '89, when you guys had your first case in California, to how it is today.
You know, probably the best way to describe it is that in those early days, you needed a much larger amount of DNA, and it had to be more intact. In other words, not exposed to the elements than you now. So essentially, what happened is the tests they were developed to be much more sensitive to be able to get results from very, very small amounts of DNA. And also more informative because they were able to, I'll just try to use lay jargon here, they were able to derive a lot more identifying information so that when they compared two samples and they were consistent across the board, the meaning was much more powerful. And in fact, you know, the results that they're capable of producing now, essentially what a scientist can say is no one's ever been born with the DNA profile that gets produced.
Right. The way that I understand DNA is that it's a one-to-one match, right? It's like a serial number. And the way that the law will allow people to use that evidence to prosecute is if it is a direct match. And what familial search does is that it allows you to search different portions of that string to try to make matches across familial ties. What is the resistance that you hear about in other states towards legalizing it, you know, across the country?
I think it's safe to say that if you look at the states that are doing it in the U.S., they're among the most liberal states in the country. And then you come to Mississippi and go, well, why does California care more about catching criminals than Mississippi? And that's the million-dollar question. To me, the most logical question, rather than debate it, because you're never going to get people to change their philosophy about these things. The more important question is, well, how did California address it and not Mississippi? Or how did California address it and not South Carolina or Georgia? I mean, things are upside down on this issue, at least from a political perspective. You got California, Colorado, and New York that are doing it. You know, 3 out of the 11 states that are doing it. And you have all these other states that are profoundly conservative not doing it. It just doesn't make sense. If nobody flushes the discussion out, you know, the only thing I've seen in the news from Mississippi is that article that I think was triggered by you doing this. Yeah, that's the only discussion. And you know, what you have to realize is, if you remember the history I told you about, it's not like this is a new subject. This has been hotly discussed. I've been retired for over 10 years. There was a major conference hosted by the FBI that I spoke at probably 2 years before I retired, where we talked about all this stuff. So anybody that doesn't know and doesn't have an opinion somehow needs to get one. Needs to be forced to discuss it openly, because this is a tool, as you know, from that webinar report that I gave you. I think I gave that to you.
Yeah, it was fascinating. It was dense, but it was fascinating. Yeah. When I first met Rock over email, the very first thing he did was send me a thorough document full of graphs and links called Familial DNA Searching: Current Approaches. Back in 2015, Rock participated in a webinar conducted by the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, where they gathered a panel of experts to thoroughly go through familial DNA and explain both the science and its potential benefits to criminal investigations. This document alone took me from knowing practically nothing about DNA, beyond what I've seen on TV, to a pretty good working knowledge of how this research is currently being used and the impact it can make going forward. If you'd like to dig in, I've put the doc on our website. Go to knockknockpodcast.com/episode-6.
Yeah, this process, if we try to compare it with CODIS, the national database, this seems to be as efficient as CODIS is in solving cases. And you know, by the way, I remember when we first started using the database to try to solve crimes, no one ever predicted what percentage of cases we'd ever solve, anything like that. Anything more than nothing was an improvement and was a credit to society, you know, that public officials serve. They have jobs to serve the public. And so anything more than nothing, as I said, would have been a great improvement. And everybody knew intuitively that the database itself, not yet familial searching, was going to be successful. It was going to be worth the effort. And no one's ever questioned that. And so we demonstrated in the webinar that familial searching seems to have the same promise.
Do you feel like the resistance is based on just fear of false prosecution or witch hunting?
It's an excuse. That's just an excuse to end the conversation. Because as I say, if you want to find out, not for me, I'm an advocate, I'm a strong advocate for this thing, but if you want to find out how those other states address those issues, ask them rather than me. Why believe me?
No, that's a great point.
It's just we have enough of them now to say, okay, did you ask them, or did you just decide in Oxford that we're not going to do it? And if so, then I think there's public scrutiny and criticism is in order.
And so do you think that the states that aren't doing it, is it out of just not knowing the benefits, or is it just lack of advocacy? Or it seems like, especially with high-profile cases, Bill mentioned the Grim Sleeper case, right, that was directly solved because of familial search. Wouldn't that be enough for other states to say, well, clearly this is a good thing? The sound bites you heard at the very beginning of this episode were taken from various news broadcasts reporting on a case nicknamed the Grim Sleeper Murders. You may remember Sergeant Lott discussing this particular case in our last episode. Starting in 1985, about 5 years before Betty and Kathryn's murders, the brutal killings of at least 10 people occurred in Los Angeles, and as of 2010 had not been solved. Rock was the driving force behind the California Attorney General's decision to implement familial DNA searching in California. Using this tool, they were able to locate Lonnie David Franklin Jr. through a partial match to his brother. On May 5th, 2016, 31 years after his first crime, Franklin was convicted of 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. And a month later, a Los Angeles County jury sentenced the serial killer to death.
You would think so. I mean, it's not hard to. When I go to a state, I Google unsolved serial rapes, unsolved serial murders. Many states have websites where they list those things. So it's not hard to find a poster child to support the argument, because otherwise, if you discuss it abstractly, it's not a very powerful discussion. You might solve some cases, but if you go to Google Kansas serial rapist, you will see that there's a serial rapist who's raped college co-eds, I think at University of Kansas and Kansas State, and they have a huge website and a task force and all this stuff, but they don't want to talk about familial searching. And you go, why is that? You can't ask me that, because I don't, people don't want to talk to me about it unless they want to do it. And you can't convince somebody that they want to do it whose mind is closed about it. I do know that labs are busy, labs are overworked, but part of the problem is if they don't publicly address what they can't do and how much money it's going to cost to get it, it's never going to happen.
Let's take a quick break. While living in Ethiopia, some friends of mine witnessed firsthand the consequences of extreme poverty. They saw how Ethiopian women, in an effort to provide for themselves and their families, were forced to make unthinkable choices just to survive. These friends realized they wanted to give these women another choice, one that would provide them the opportunity to earn a living. It was from this experience that Fashionable was born. This movement started with a collection of hand-woven scarves, of which my wife has many, and has grown to include handmade leather bags and jewelry, apparel, shoes, and most recently, a premium denim line, lovingly crafted by women who have overcome extraordinary circumstances. We're so honored to partner with Fashionable and offer our listeners 15% off their first order. Go to livefashionable.com and use the discount code KNOCK15 at checkout. Again, visit livefashionable.com today to help bring opportunity and choice to these amazing women.
The Clarion Ledger, September 19th, 2017. While Jason Jones continues to fight for Betty Jones and Kathryn Krigler via the podcast, police investigators continue to exhaust every resource at their disposal to solve the case. But is it possible there is something inhibiting Mississippi law enforcement? Do they have access to every available investigative tool? In Mississippi, the use of familial DNA search cannot be used because there is no definitive protocol in place, according to law enforcement officials. When asked for comment regarding the potential use of familial DNA search in Mississippi, Attorney General Jim Hood stated, "I'm working with the state crime lab to determine whether legislation would be beneficial as a precautionary measure, developing proper protocols, and in the procurement of necessary software. We support any tool that helps law enforcement do their job." So you understand, this topic has been on the burner for over 10 years. The question for your community should be why the state, Mississippi, hasn't implemented it yet, while the liberal states have done so, said Rockne Harmon, a consultant and retired senior deputy district attorney for Alameda County, California. Familial DNA search is a lab testing method by which, for example, a rape kit with semen evidence is run through the state's own convicted violent offender database, with the aim of getting a list of genetically related profiles. To date, California, Colorado, Florida, Ohio, Michigan, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Wisconsin, and Wyoming have protocol in place for the use of familial DNA search in solving violent crimes. In July, Justin Christian of Ohio became the first criminal in that state to be tracked down via familial DNA search. Ohio had Christian's DNA from his rape of a 6-year-old girl, but did not know it was his. After searching the state DNA database, there was no exact genetic match to him because Christian had not yet been caught and convicted of a violent crime. So Ohio law enforcement then turned to familial DNA search. A match was found with several people related to Christian through a distinct genetic line. Christian was subsequently brought to justice and is serving a 35-year sentence without the possibility of parole. Sergeant Bill Lott of the Starkville Police Department has worked the Jones-Krigler murder case since 2001. "This case is very important to me. I will not give up on it. I want to work on it even if after I retire," Lott said. Lott believes in the individual right to privacy, but also advocates for the use of familial DNA search as a tool for law enforcement. The science of familial DNA search is not only recognized but endorsed. There is no prohibition of familial search, but the proper protocol of how to do it. They, the crime lab, do not participate in criminal investigations, and therefore, they neither advocate for or against familial DNA search. This would be for the law enforcement to promote and for the citizens of Mississippi who want to see victims get justice.
What is the difference between doing just a standard DNA search that seems to be pretty prevalent in today's crime solving?
Yeah.
What is the difference between that search and doing a familial search?
When a profile from the crime scene is typed and then it gets uploaded to be searched against the state, and then if there's no match there at the national level, the question that the software is answering is there anybody that actually fully matches this profile? Okay? And the national database is over 15 million people. So that's a pretty good number. About 30% of them ever match anybody. So at least 70%. And you saw in the webinar report, we use this to demonstrate that familiar searching has, using the same metrics, has a very similar success rate. But familiar searching asks a different question. The question that familiar searching addresses using this software is there anyone in the database who looks like a close relative of the person who left the evidence? And close relative in this context is limited to parent, child, or full sibling. And so at the end of the two-step process, when it says this looks like a brother or this looks like a father-son, that's a pretty definitive answer to that question. At that point, the investigators have to investigate the family structure of that person. And these things usually happen pretty simply to try to assess which family member is most likely. And a parent-child, the genetically looks different than a full sibling. So you either know you're looking for a father or a son or a full sibling. So there's a recent Texas success illustrates this point. They went through the process, said it's got to be a brother of this guy. And it doesn't give you more than one person. When it gives you anything, it gives you something about 30% of the time. And it says, look at this family, father, son, full sibling. In the Texas case, they looked at this guy's family because it said it looks like it's this guy's brother. So I don't know how many brothers he had, but when they looked at this one brother in particular, they said, holy cow, he lived in the same apartment complex where this violent murder, rape had occurred. I mean, but that's how simple it is. And then they followed him around, saw him toss a couple of cigarette butts, collected the butts. They were able to type the butts before they even arrested him. He matched the evidence at that point. So, but that's fairly typical of these investigations. Once you identify the family in the relationship, father, son, full sibling, the investigations are pretty simple. This is what cops do all the time. And in a smaller community, the cops are going to say, holy cow, we already know everybody in that family. It's got to be this guy.
At the very least, it's a great tool for just lead generation, right? If it's a cold case and nothing has happened and all the leads have dried up, at least gets you something else to look into, even if it doesn't result in a match.
Well, but here's what you need to know. Every time it's produced that kind of lead, it's been successfully pursued and matched the first person they looked at. So it's not like an anonymous phone call, which you want your cops to be following up on. It's a lead that, for what we've seen so far in this country, the cops have always been able to figure out who the person is, get a sample from him. And most of the investigations have been like the Texas case. The legal principle is called abandoned DNA. Go through your garbage. In the Grim Sleeper case, collect utensils from where he was eating pizza. And that's all totally lawful under the Fourth Amendment. And it also doesn't invade anybody's privacy in the sense that if they arrested him and collected a sample, it would take time to type the evidence. This way, they don't arrest anybody until they're absolutely certain that person matches the DNA from the crime scene.
It's actually just an additional step to the tried and true method of, directly matching DNA. Is that even if you get this familial search, it sounds like law enforcement is still going to go and try to find that pure DNA sample to match it against the evidence from the scene.
Right. It's stupid to arrest somebody because it could be, and to the best of my knowledge, it's never happened that using the familial searching that they collected from the wrong brother. So, but that's simply because we have skilled investigators. They know when they get a lead like this how to develop it. But at the same time, the person doesn't even know the police are onto them. And then, and only when it matches, just like this, it'd be the same match that you get from the initial CODIS search, only then does the person get arrested. So the Grim Sleeper did not get arrested, even though they knew in the context of this case, it had to be him. He lived right in the middle of where all these young women were murdered and dumped. There was no point. They kept him under close surveillance, but they didn't arrest him until the stuff from the restaurant was typed, determined to be a match, and then and only then did they arrest him.
What are the steps that need to happen in order to have familial search passed in Mississippi?
Obtain software. There's 2 or 3 different softwares that different people use. And, I've offered to help them with this in any way. And I've never had any communication with them. But yeah, they need to, decide which software to use. First off, they have to decide they can do it. And rather than, go over everything we just talked about, the real answer is why are you any different than any of the other states that are doing it? Because people can, I hate to say this, but I've coined a phrase that when I talk to somebody like you, or a reporter or a victim family member, I just say, you have to understand, in this context, can't means won't. It's real simple. So first they have to decide that they can, and then they have to decide that they will. And other states are in the process of doing it now. Arizona, Louisiana. Louisiana's right there for you to help out. I know that, people in this business, they all know each other, so it would be really easy for them to tap into the experience that Louisiana is going through. But first, they have to want to.
I'm just going to be honest. Hearing Rock say that in his experience, can't really means won't is really frustrating. Especially knowing that the only barrier to using this tool is a piece of software that already exists. Just imagine if your loved one was killed, whether it was recently or, like in our case, 27 years ago, and you found out that there was another tool that could be used to help find answers and justice. Wouldn't you want to at least see if it could help? And even if it couldn't help you, don't you think it could help someone else in a similar situation? I understand that I may be naive to the complexity of this situation. However, after the dozens of people that I've spoken to and interviewed and emailed, no one has a specific answer as to why this can't be done in Mississippi, and specifically for Betty and Kathryn's case. So the real question is, who can actually get this done? And is that dialogue, does that dialogue start at the Attorney General's office, or is that all the way down to the Mississippi Crime Lab, advocating for that? Where in the chain, who are the decision makers, I guess, is the best question.
I'm pretty sure Mississippi is like most states, where the state police own, and I shouldn't say own, but the lab is under the state police, and the Attorney General is over there. And so that's really the question that someone needs to come to grips with. But before you start asking that question, the lab has to want to do it. There's no point doing any, trying to see if anybody will be supportive of it, unless the lab says, "Yep, we want to do it." It'll cost $100,000 to. I'm making that up. When you ask a bureaucrat how much something costs, they have so many different ways of calculating that I couldn't begin to predict what someone would say. If you have a full-time employee who's going to be doing something or other, then somebody's got to decide what's important. And I think this is pretty important. So the state police typically have their own legal representative, but somebody has to get out of their own negativity and talk to somebody who's done it if they really want to find out what the answers are.
Let's take another quick break. If there's one thing I've learned about Betty through this process, is that her life was dedicated to giving back. I know she would have loved organizations like Thistle Farms. At first glance, Thistle Farms is a world-class provider of natural home and body products. In the summertime, their bug spray is a must. But what is truly amazing about these items are the people who make them. All of Thistle Farms products are lovingly crafted by women, survivors of trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. You see, beneath the surface, what Thistle Farms really is a place that provides safe housing, economic independence, and a strong community of advocates for these women. Take a minute to visit thistlefarms.org and learn more about this amazing organization. And while you're there, use the discount code KNOCK15 for 15% off your first order. That's thistlefarms.org, where love is the most powerful force for change in the world. Back in 2015, through additional search, they were able to find possible connections to the family names Hicks and Devine. What is the difference between that and what we're talking about with familial search?
Yeah, that's a shot in the dark. I mean, so is this other gimmick called Parabon. Drawing the picture from the DNA. Those are inferior. I've only ever heard of one situation where predicting a name ever panned out. Not that it wouldn't, there can always be a second time, but that's what you do when you won't have, because you don't need the lab to help you with that. But the state owns the database. You have to deal with the state. They're the ones that have to agree to do it. So, but I mean, that'll be interesting when the case gets solved to see that, if that pans out. But, even with that, where does that take you? It's great if there was somebody who lived nearby that had that last name, but if that's not the case, then where do you begin? That's like an upside down triangle. You're starting at the bottom and you're looking up, and you can't see where it is on either side. Instead of something like familial searching that says, look at this family, father, son, or brother.
This story has impacted so many people over the past 27 years. For the people that are listening to this and are passionate about trying to get this solved, hopefully through tools like familial search, what can just the average person do to advocate the state government for these changes? Having a highly publicized case always helps. If you look at, that's what happened in New York. New York would have been one of the last states that I would think would ever do familial searching. But a young woman was murdered. Her father was very vocal. I contacted the reporter, like I've done with you. I educated him, and he wrote a story saying, this new technique might help solve the case. The father took it and ran with it to force New York State to publicly say, yeah, we need to take a look at this. And so they're in the process of put the finishing touches on doing their first cases right now. So it sounds like the best way to see change is just the grassroots effort of people actually caring and having an opinion.
Yeah, but putting a face on it. when I give a talk on this, I've got a slide that's got the scales of justice, public safety, privacy. And we make those decisions every day in things that we do. A cop on patrol makes those kind of decisions all the time. But don't discuss it anonymously. You put a face on public safety. This young woman murdered your family member, any of those things. And then it becomes, because in the abstract, privacy is always, we cherish our privacy. But when you put a face on what you're trying to do and then how you're trying to do it, adhering to privacy restraints and just trying to solve this crime, then all of a sudden it changes the whole discussion.
I would imagine you could also speak to these lawmakers about their own family. Like who wouldn't use every tool at their disposal to try and stop this, See, you said you put up a red flag there. Okay, lawmakers. Once you say it's somebody else's decision, I mean, look at what's going on today. Once you put it in somebody else's hands, then you don't have to do anything. And here's why I say that. Every state that's decided to do familial searching realized that their own laws already empowered them to do that. And what that means is none of them sought to change their laws to do that. Because I don't care what state you're in, once you get involved in legislation, trade-offs happen that castrate, emasculate, take away any meaning from what you went in there for. And so any law enforcement leader that wants to do this legislatively doesn't want to do it, plain and simple, or doesn't want to make the decision that he gets paid the big bucks to make. So it really does take just the right case and the loudest voice.
And the right people. Yep. And they have to be honest about it. And honestly, the best conversation when you hear hesitation is, how did California do it? How did Colorado do it? And none of these states are reaching out to anybody else because they already know what the answers are.
In the case of Colorado and California, for instance, if I was going to reach out and talk to them about their experience on how they made it happen, is that start with the crime lab? Is it people on the ground in the crime lab who are...
In Colorado, yes. The Denver crime lab and the Denver DA were the driving force. In California, it was we DAs that were the driving force.
So it sounds like really a strong DA who is
right.
That's really could be the change agent to making something happen.
Except for Colorado and California, in most states the DAs played no role in it, which is more typical.
Gotcha.
So I think at the end of it, you have to say, well, somebody who knows what they're doing has to want to do it. That's pretty sad when that's all you need, and it's not happening.
Okay, so what's next? Like Rockne said, it's not about the lawmakers. It's about us. Like he said, once you put it into someone else's hands, then you don't have to do anything. I want to thank Rock so much for his time and his continued effort to advocate for familial search. Like he said, it's pretty sad to think that it just takes someone who sees the value and has the authority to want to get this done. As I've mentioned before, that's what this podcast is all about. Telling Betty and Kathryn's story so loud that someone has to notice and do something about it. We are so fortunate to have people like Sergeant Bill Lott, who is tirelessly working on this case, the MSU Reflector, who has covered this podcast, the Starkville Daily News, who feature Betty and Kathryn's story all the way back from 1990 until now, the Clarion Ledger, whose article we read from earlier in the show, and everyone else who has shared this show with their friends and neighbors. But next, it's going to take you. Next time on Knock Knock.
Silently tracing the cracks through the chaos.
We wrap up this season with a recap of everything we know and paint a clear picture of what needs to be done going forward. We also share some special announcements about the future of Knock Knock and how this community can come together to cause real change. Knock Knock is produced by Chris Cerrone and me. Special thanks to the Knock Knock team: Lacey Orcioli, Rebecca Jones, Jason Adams, Simon Jones, Cole Flynn, Colleen Jones, and Maggie Thomas. To join the Knock Knock community, be sure and connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Knock Knock Pod. There you can ask questions, leave comments, or just say hi. We've also set up a voicemail at 1-888-57-BETTY. If you have any comments or questions, or you'd like to be a part of the show, please call and leave a message. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you download podcasts. Reviews are key to keeping Knock Knock on the charts where people can find our show. Our outro music was provided by my friend and one of my favorite artists, Matthew Perriman Jones. To listen to more of his music, please visit mpjmusic.com. We'll be back soon with our next full episode, and we'll post a quick Q&A episode between now and then. So make sure and get your questions and comments in soon. Thanks again for subscribing to the Knock Knock Podcast.
You stand in the water with your arms crossed.